You call yourself a leader? You will go down in history as the greatest disappointment in the history of American democracy. Arnold Schwarzenegger's voice echoed around the room, which was packed with reporters and political analysts. I have a proposition, Donald. Let's switch places. You go into the movie business, since you're so obsessed with ratings, and I'll take over your presidential duties. At least the American people will be able to sleep soundly. Trump's face beamed onto the giant screen, was purple with rage. His fingers were flying frantically over the phone keypad. Nobody, don't you listen. Nobody tells me what to do. This failed actor and the worst governor in the history of California. Everyone knows his ratings were terrible. And my America is great. The tension in the room was at its peak. The journalists held their breath. This was not just a political debate. It was a clash of titans that could change the course of American history forever. The most interesting part is coming. Stay with us to find out how it all ends. In the meantime, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't lose it. Washington was rocked by an unexpected political earthquake when the legendary Arnold Schwarzenegger released his address to the nation. It spread across the internet faster than a wildfire in dry California, dividing America into two irreconcilable camps. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Thomas Riley, the lead political commentator on the American Pravda network, was preparing for his latest episode of his show, Unfiltered Politics, when his assistant Jessica ran into the room with an expression that only comes when a war is being declared or a president is being impeached. Tom, did you see this? Schwarzenegger just released a video message. It's blowing up the internet, she blurted out, holding out her tablet. Tom glanced at the screen and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. There on the screen was Arnold Schwarzenegger, but not the smiling action hero America was accustomed to. In front of him sat a serious politician with eyes full of determination and, more alarmingly, well-founded concern for the future of the country. "Oh my God," Tom whispered. "This is going to be the hottest episode in the show's history." 30 minutes later, all of America was already discussing Arnold Schwarzenegger's address, every word of which hit the target like a surgeon's scalpel. "Fellow Americans," Arnold began, his Austrian accent giving his words extra weight. "I speak to you not as a Hollywood star, not as a former governor of California. I speak to you as a man who has seen where fear and hatred can lead. I was born 2 years after the end of World War II. I grew up among broken men who drank to forget their guilt for participating in the most monstrous regime in human history." The camera moved closer to his face, highlighting every wrinkle, evidence of the years he had lived and the wisdom he had accumulated. "When I look at what's happening in our country today, I see familiar patterns. I hear the same words. I feel the same fear. And I can't stay silent." The Washington Post newsroom was dead silent when editor-in-chief Michael Stevens played the video at a town hall. 20 of the country's top journalists sat motionless, absorbing every word from the former Terminator who was now acting as a defender of democracy. The man who now occupies the Oval Office has betrayed his oath of office. He has betrayed the Constitution. But worst of all, he has betrayed the American people. Arnold paused, his voice breaking with barely contained emotion. "He has used your fears, your economic hardships, your faith in a great America to divide us, to set us against each other, to destroy what makes us Americans, our commitment to liberty and justice for all." James Porter, a conservative columnist known for his support of Trump, nervously drummed his fingers on the table. This was not just a political statement. It was a challenge from a man who knew what he was talking about, a man who had risen from immigrant to global star and successful politician, and worst of all, a man who was respected on both sides of the political spectrum. The Oval Office was in chaos. President Trump paced the room, his face the color of an overripe tomato. His aides huddled in corners, knowing a storm was coming. "Who gives him the right?" Trump's roar seemed capable of splitting the massive presidential desk. "This immigrant with an accent dares to lecture me? Me, the 45th president of the United States?" Sarah Hawkins, the new White House press secretary, was desperate to come up with a response strategy. "Sir, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Trump snapped, grabbing his phone. "I'll handle this myself." Twitter. Now. In the CNN studio, where breaking news coverage of the political earthquake was underway, analysts tried to comprehend the scale of what was happening. "Alex, what we're seeing is unprecedented," said Rachel Clark, the political panel's host. A former Republican governor, openly accusing a sitting Republican president of betrayal. This isn't just an intra-party conflict. This is a civil war within the Republican Party. Alex Davidson, a political strategist for 2 decades, shook his head. Rachel, this is much more serious than that. Schwarzenegger is not appealing to party loyalty, but to the core of American identity. He's talking about things that transcend party politics. He's talking about democracy, about the Constitution, about what it means to be an American. But will this change the minds of Trump's loyal supporters? Rachel asked. Alex thought about it. Maybe not, but there are millions of waverers, millions who sense that something is wrong, but are afraid to admit it, even to themselves. And now here comes a man who can hardly be accused of liberal bias, a man who embodies the American dream and says, yes, your fears are justified. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, in the modest offices of the Schwarzenegger Institute for Public Policy, the phones kept ringing. Jacob Williams, a former aide to Arnold during his governorship, and now the Institute's executive director, was trying to cope with the information tsunami. No, Arnold is not planning to run, he repeated wearily once again. This is not a political move. This is the civic position of a man who loves this country. His assistant, Maria Rodriguez, hung up and turned to him with a look of shock on her face. Jake, you're not going to believe this. Fox News wants to interview you. Fox News! Jacob paused, realizing the significance of the moment. Fox News was the bastion of conservative America, Trump's unofficial mouthpiece. If they wanted to hear Arnold, it meant his words had reached a much wider audience than they could have hoped for. Tell them we'll consider their offer, he said slowly, trying to buy time to consult with Arnold. Meanwhile, in suburban Milwaukee, Wisconsin, James Garrison, an Iraq War veteran and staunch Republican, sat in his living room, staring at the television. On his lap was the Make America Great Again cap he had until recently worn with pride. His wife, Sarah, stood in the doorway, watching her husband with concern. Jim, are you okay? She asked quietly. James didn't answer right away. On the screen was the face of Schwarzenegger, the man whose films had shaped his youthful ideas of strength and justice. The man who had once said, if you get knocked down, get up and keep moving forward. Now that man was saying things that were forcing James to rethink not his political stance, but his understanding of what it meant to be a patriot. Sarah, he finally said, twirling his red cap, you know, I supported Trump because I believed he really wanted to make America great. But Schwarzenegger is right. A country is not great because it has a strong leader or a powerful military. It is great because of its values. And if we have to choose between loyalty to a person and loyalty to those values, those words were echoed in thousands of homes across America. The silent army of Republican doubters, those who felt increasingly uncomfortable with Trump's rhetoric and policies but were afraid to admit it, suddenly had a voice, and that voice belonged to the Terminator. Meanwhile, Arnold's video was approaching its climax. I have a proposition, Mr. President, Schwarzenegger said with the smirk that had become his trademark in Hollywood. Let's switch places. You like to talk about ratings and show business. So do that, and I'll take care of national security, the unity of our country, and the preservation of our democracy. Believe me, Americans will finally be able to sleep soundly. The phrase sparked a flurry of reactions on social media, with the hashtag Shashin swapped with Schwarzenegger rocketing to the top of Twitter trends. In New York, at the offices of the New York Times, journalists were feverishly working on a special edition dedicated to this political earthquake. I want a reaction from every Republican senator, commanded Robert Chang, the political editor. I want to know who will stand with Trump and who will decide it's time to distance themselves from this sinking ship. Julia Wright, a young, ambitious journalist who specialized in covering right-wing movements, raised her hand. Robert, I just got word from a source at Proud Patriots of America. They're pissed. They're running an online campaign against Schwarzenegger. They're calling him a traitor and threatening to boycott all his movies. Robert chuckled. It's like they were watching Ballet for Beginners. What about the moderate Republicans? Have we heard anything from them? Senator Johnson of Ohio just put out a statement, said Mike Peterson, a senior political analyst, saying that while he disagrees with all of Schwarzenegger's assessments, he shares his concerns about the tone and direction of the current political debate. He's not taking sides, essentially, but he's giving himself some wiggle room. Typical, Robert snorted. Has anyone made a definitive statement? You wouldn't believe it, Julia looked up from her laptop. Senator Graham. He just went live on Fox News and said that, while he respects the president, Schwarzenegger's words deserve serious consideration. That's practically treason in today's Republican Party. Robert whistled. It started, party split on live TV. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in his luxurious Bel Air estate, Arnold Schwarzenegger sat in his home office, watching the reaction to his video. At his side was his longtime friend and collaborator Danny DeVito, who had rushed to support his friend at this critical moment. Arnie, do you realize you just put it all on the line? Danny asked, sipping his whiskey. Half the country loves you now, and the other half hates you. Schwarzenegger shrugged with the quiet confidence that had been his hallmark since the start of his career. Danny, there are times in life when you have to stand up and tell the truth, even if it costs you everything. My country is on the brink of disaster. I couldn't keep quiet. Your country? DeVito smiled. You speak like a true American, Arnie. I am a true American, Schwarzenegger replied, unsmiling. Perhaps more so than those born here, because I chose this country. I fought for the right to be called an American, and I will fight to preserve what truly makes America great. Our freedom, our unity, our belief that all men are created equal. DeVito shook his head thoughtfully. You know what's scary about your speech for Trump? That you're speaking in a language his own supporters understand. You're not some liberal elitist from the coastal states. You're the Terminator, for God's sake, a symbol of strength and determination. If you say there's a problem, people listen. Schwarzenegger nodded, realizing his friend was right. That's why I had to speak out. Someone had to tell these people the truth, not to insult them or humiliate them for their choices, but to remind them what we're all really fighting for. Their conversation was interrupted by a ringing phone. The name Mitch McConnell appeared on the screen. DeVito whistled. The Senate Majority Leader himself. Now the real game begins. Schwarzenegger picked up the phone but did not answer right away. He knew that the next few days would determine the fate of not only him, but perhaps the entire country. By evening that same day, tensions had reached a boiling point. President Trump, as expected, responded with a flurry of tweets, each more angry and volatile than the last. Arnold Schwarzenegger is a fail as an actor. My ratings on The Apprentice were much higher. A fail as a governor and a fail as an American. It's sad to see a once great man fall so low. Shame. Dozens more tweets followed, each one reinforcing the impression that the president was in the midst of an emotional breakdown. At MSNBC, analysts could hardly contain their astonishment. Rachel, I've never seen anything like this, said veteran political journalist John Hampton. Imagine if President Reagan suddenly started publicly insulting John Wayne. That's about the same level of culture shock. Schwarzenegger is an American pop culture icon. He's loved and respected by millions of Americans, including many Trump supporters. But that's not all, Rachel Maddow added. Notice that Trump has never once denied any of Schwarzenegger's specific allegations. He hasn't said, I didn't betray the Constitution, or I'm not a divisive person. He's simply attacking Arnold as a person, as a career. It's a classic distraction tactic, and it's looking increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, the battle was gaining momentum on social media. Supporters of the president organized a flash mob with the hashtag #YourFailedArnold, while Trump opponents and even many moderate Republicans united under the banner Terminator vs. Tyrant. In a small restaurant in San Antonio, Texas, the Martinez family watched the drama unfold on the television screen. Jose Martinez, the owner of a small construction company and a longtime Republican, scratched his head in confusion. I don't know, Dad, said his daughter Elena, a political science major. Schwarzenegger says things that make you think, and he's not some Democrat from California. He's a Republican like us. Was a Republican, her younger brother Miguel corrected her. Don't you follow the news? The Republican Party is Trump's party now. If you're not with him, you're against the party. And is that normal? Elena asked. One person above the whole party, above its principles and history? Isn't that the problem Schwarzenegger is talking about? Jose listened intently to his children's argument, his eyes filled with deep concern. He had voted Republican his entire adult life, believing in their values: personal responsibility, limited government, strong national security. But in recent years, he increasingly felt that the party was drifting away from those principles, becoming more like a cult of personality. Children, he finally said, perhaps it's time to remind yourself what it means to be a true American. It doesn't mean blindly following a leader, no matter who he is. It means standing up for the principles on which this country was founded. In Washington, D.C., Republican members of Congress and senators gathered for an emergency meeting at the Capitol. Ostensibly, it was about strategy for the upcoming budget vote. But the real agenda was clear to all present: what to do about the escalating crisis. Gentlemen and ladies, of course, Senator McConnell began, looking around the room. Let's get this straight. Schwarzenegger's speech has caused quite a stir. My aides tell me the phones in the office have not stopped ringing. And it's not just the president's rabid opponents calling, it's our constituents, our base, calling. They're confused, they're asking questions. They're embarrassed because a Hollywood star decided to play politics, said Congressman Jim Jordan, one of Trump's staunchest supporters. We should be rallying around the president in this difficult moment, not being provoked by a California rhino. Reno, the Republican in name only, was a favorite Trumpist insult for moderates in the party. Jim, Senator Romney responded calmly, Schwarzenegger is not just a Hollywood star. He was the governor of the largest state in the country, a Republican governor. And many of the concerns he expressed are shared by respected members of our party, including some in this room. A murmur ran through the room, some expressing agreement, others indignation. What are you proposing, Mitt? McConnell asked coldly. Openly turn against the president? That would be political suicide for many of us. I suggest we remember our oath of office, Romney replied firmly. We swore to uphold the Constitution, not a particular person. If the president acts contrary to the Constitution, it is our duty to hold him accountable. This is demagogy, Jordan exploded. You want to destroy the party because of a personal grudge against the president. McConnell raised his hand, calling for silence. Gentlemen, we need a unified strategy. Division will only heighten the sense of crisis. I propose this. We publicly express support for the president, but we also recognize the right of every American, including Mr. Schwarzenegger, to have his own opinion. We do not attack him personally. That will only strengthen his position. Instead, we focus on the administration's accomplishments. Tax reform, judicial appointments, a strong economy. Before the pandemic, of course. It was classic McConnell, cautious, calculating, always looking for a compromise that would allow him to retain power. But this time his proposal met with unexpected resistance. With all due respect, Senator, said Liz Cheney, one of the few women in the party's leadership, I'm not sure that the standard political games are going to work here. Schwarzenegger was touching on something deeper. He wasn't talking about policy. He was talking about character. He was talking about values. He was talking about what it means to be an American. And I'm afraid that if we just brush that aside, we'll lose not only the next election, but the soul of our party. There was silence. Cheney's words had said what many had been thinking, but were afraid to say. The Republican Party faced an existential choice, and no one knew which way it would go. Meanwhile, at the White House, the situation was heating up. President Trump called an emergency meeting of his team, but instead of a strategic discussion, it turned into a monologue of anger and accusations. They're all against me, Trump shouted as he paced the Oval Office. The media, the Democrats, now even the Republicans. Traitors, every single one of them. Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, tried to reassure the president. Sir, many Republicans have expressed their full support for you. Senator Graham has already given several interviews where... Graham? Trump interrupted. Graham is a coward. I saw him on Fox today, and he basically agreed with that. That Austrian muscle man. I think he's an American citizen, sir, Kellyanne Conway, a presidential advisor, said quietly. I don't care, Trump snapped. He attacked me. Me, the most successful president in history. And what did you do to protect me? Nothing. The advisors looked at each other with alarm. They were used to the president's outbursts of anger, but today something was different. There was not just anger in his eyes, but real fear. The fear of a man who suddenly realized that his power might not be as absolute as he thought. Sir, Meadows began carefully, I think we need a more thoughtful strategy than just attacking Schwarzenegger on Twitter. That only reinforces his message. Maybe we should focus on your accomplishments, your agenda for a second term. I know what to do, Trump interrupted. We're going to have a rally, a huge rally, the biggest rally in history, in Phoenix or Dallas, somewhere where they love me. I'm going to get on stage and everyone will see who the real leader is. Meadows noticed with alarm that the president was speaking more quickly, jumping from one thought to another, as he often did when he was particularly excited or upset. Twitter, give me the phone, Trump demanded. I'm going to show this Schwarzenegger how to attack me. I'm going to destroy him. I'm going to destroy him. Sarah Hawkins, the press secretary, cast a pleading glance at Meadows. They both knew that in his state, the president might write something that would only make matters worse. Sir, Meadows tried one last time, perhaps we should take a moment to think about strategy. We could prepare a formal statement that would be dignified and presidential. Worthy? Trump exploded. He called me a traitor. A traitor. Me, the man who has done more for this country than anyone since Lincoln. And you want me to be worthy? With these words, he grabbed his phone and began typing furiously. At that moment, across town, at the luxurious Four Seasons Hotel, Arnold Schwarzenegger was preparing for an interview with ABC News. It was his first television appearance since the video message, and everyone knew its importance. Arnold, we go on air in 2 minutes, the producer said. Are there any topics you don't want to cover? Schwarzenegger grinned his famous half-smile. I've never backed down from a fight. Ask me anything. George Stephanopoulos, the program's host and one of the most respected journalists in the country, sat down across from Schwarzenegger. Mr. Governor, your video message has caused quite a political storm. Did you expect this kind of reaction? George, when the truth comes out, it always causes a storm, Schwarzenegger replied calmly. I was not speaking as a politician. I was speaking as an American who sees his country heading in a dangerous direction. President Trump just posted a series of tweets calling you a failed actor, the worst governor in California history, and a sore loser. How do you respond to these accusations? Schwarzenegger thought for a moment, then shook his head with a slight smile. You know, George, that's the problem. The president is attacking me personally instead of answering the specific issues I've raised. That's what I call petty politics. It distracts us from the real issues. I'm not going to get into that morass of insults. The American people deserve better. But you yourself used rather harsh language against the president, calling him a traitor to the Constitution. Isn't that a personal attack? No, George. This is not a personal attack. It is a statement of fact. When a president incites the storming of the Capitol, when he denies the results of a fair election, when he incites hatred between Americans, that is a betrayal of the oath he took. That is not an opinion. That is a fact. Many people criticize you for being a Republican and attacking a Republican president. Some call you a traitor to the party. George, my loyalty is not to party, but to country. The Republican Party I knew and loved stood for individual liberty, responsibility, and respect for the Constitution. If today's Republican Party departs from those values, it is not I who have betrayed it, but those who have betrayed the very essence of what it means to be a Republican. Stephanopoulos nodded, acknowledging the force of that argument. Some have suggested that your speech could be the beginning of a political campaign. Are you planning to return to politics, perhaps to challenge President Trump in a future election? Schwarzenegger laughed. George, as you well know, I cannot run for president. I was not born in this country. But even if I could, my goal right now is not to gain power. My goal is to remind Americans of the values that make this country great. Meanwhile, in the small town of Louisville, Kentucky, Sarah Johnson, a history teacher at the local school, was giving an impromptu lesson to her high school students. On the board was written, Democracy, Fragility, and Resilience. Guys, she said, looking at the interested faces of her students, what's happening in our country right now is not just a political dispute. This is a moment that will be studied in history books, and you are lucky to be witnessing it in real time. Miss Johnson, Tyler, one of the more vocal students, raised his hand. My father says Schwarzenegger is a traitor who is attacking our president to advance his own career. Is that true? Sarah took a deep breath. She knew Tyler's parents were staunch Trump supporters, like many in their conservative town. Tyler, in a democracy, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Both Mr. Schwarzenegger and President Trump have the right to express their views. It's our job as citizens to listen to different opinions, analyze the facts, and form our own position. But how do we know who's right? Asked Emily, a quiet girl in the back. That's a great question, Emily, Sarah smiled. In a democracy, truth doesn't come from above. It comes from open debate, from comparing different points of view, from critically examining the facts. That's why freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and respect for different opinions are so important. When those freedoms are threatened, democracy itself is threatened. The class fell silent, processing her words. These teenagers, who would become voters in a few years, were now forming their own understanding of what it meant to be a citizen of a democratic country. And Sarah knew that her words could influence what that understanding would be. Guys, she continued, I want you to watch Schwarzenegger's video and President Trump's tweets. Analyze their arguments, their style, their tone. Consider who appeals to your reason and who appeals to your emotions. And remember, being a patriot does not mean blindly supporting the government. Sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is tell the truth, even if it's inconvenient. Meanwhile, tense meetings were taking place in the offices of Silicon Valley's biggest tech companies. Trump's tweets were becoming increasingly aggressive and containing more unverified or outright false information. Should his access to the platform be restricted? And if so, what would be the consequences? We can't just block the President of the United States, Mark Zuckerberg said at an emergency Facebook management meeting. That would be an unprecedented move that would invite accusations of political bias. But we can't ignore our own rules, Sandberg countered. If anyone else posted this kind of content, their account would have been suspended long ago. We're setting a dangerous precedent of double standards. Similar discussions were taking place at Twitter's headquarters, where Jack Dorsey and his team were feverishly discussing how to respond to the president's latest tweet, in which he accused Schwarzenegger, without evidence, of secret ties to China and conspiracy to undermine national security. This goes beyond political rhetoric, one executive said. This is outright disinformation that could have real consequences. But if we block it, half the country will see it as confirmation of the technological censorship conspiracy theory, countered another. We'll be in the middle of a political storm. Ultimately, Twitter limited itself to adding a warning to Trump's tweet that it contains controversial claims. The decision pleased no one. The president's supporters saw it as censorship, and his critics saw it as not responding harshly enough to a blatant lie. At the same time, spontaneous demonstrations began to gather on the streets of American cities. In New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and dozens of other cities, thousands of people took to the streets with posters in support of Schwarzenegger and his call for a return to traditional American values. But Trump's supporters did not stand aside. In Dallas, Phoenix, Atlanta, they organized their own rallies, accusing Schwarzenegger of betrayal and supporting the president. The standoff reached a climax when it became known that both groups were planning large rallies in Washington the following day. Police and the National Guard were put on high alert, fearing possible clashes. That night, many Americans lay awake wondering where their country was headed. The democracy they had always considered unshakable suddenly showed its fragility. But at the same time, the crisis forced many to think for the first time in a long time about what it means to be an American. What values should unite the nation across political divides? And in the White House, in his bedroom, President Trump sat with his phone in hand, still firing off angry tweets. On the TV screen, a replay of Schwarzenegger's interview was playing without sound. His calm, confident face, his clear, measured answers were a stark contrast to the disheveled, red-faced president. At one point, Trump looked up at the screen and locked eyes with the virtual Schwarzenegger. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time in his presidency, he felt real fear, not for the country, but for himself and his legacy. The next morning dawned unusually clear and sunny for Washington, in contrast to the tense political atmosphere. The Capitol was bracing for a difficult day. Police blocked off key streets, storefronts were covered with metal shields, and additional barriers were erected around the Capitol and the White House. Steve Casson, the Washington police commander, gave the final briefing before the rallies began. Gentlemen, our main task today is to ensure that citizens can peacefully express their views and prevent any clashes between different groups. Schwarzenegger supporters are gathering at the Lincoln Memorial. The president's supporters are gathering at the Washington Monument. Our task is to ensure that these groups do not intersect. The phone rang. Casson picked it up, listened silently to the message, and his face darkened. "What happened, sir?" asked one of the officers. "We just got word that Arnold Schwarzenegger announced that he would personally attend a rally of his supporters, and the president, having heard about it, decided to speak to his own people as well. The situation is getting more complicated." Meanwhile, an unusual group has gathered on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. 9 Supreme Court justices, who usually carefully avoid public political statements, have decided to deliver an unprecedented address. Chief Justice John Roberts, known for his restraint and commitment to institutional norms, appeared unusually emotional as he addressed the assembled reporters. "In these difficult times for our democracy, we, the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States of America, consider it our duty to remind all citizens of the enduring value of our Constitution. This document, which has survived wars, economic crises, and profound social upheavals, remains our guiding light. It protects the rights of all Americans, regardless of their political views, and sets a framework for the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Justice Roberts paused, looking around the room. We call on all those protesting today to display the dignity and respect for the law that have always distinguished the American people. Remember that the right to peaceful protest is a fundamental right guaranteed by the First Amendment. But that right does not extend to violence or destruction of property. And remember, too, that your political opponents are not your enemies, but your fellow citizens with whom you share a common destiny. It was an exceptional moment. The Supreme Court, usually extremely cautious in its public pronouncements, saw the need to remind the country of fundamental constitutional principles. At the same time, in the office of the Schwarzenegger Institute for Public Policy, there was an air of tense anticipation. Arnold, dressed in a simple dark blue suit without a tie, was reviewing the speech he was going to give at the rally. "Jacob," he said to his assistant, "are you sure I should go there? It might just make things more tense." Jacob Williams, who had worked with Schwarzenegger since his gubernatorial days, shook his head thoughtfully. "Arnie, you started this. You can't just back down now. These people are taking to the streets because your words gave them hope that America could return to its true values. If you hide now, it will be perceived as weakness, or worse, insincerity." Schwarzenegger nodded, acknowledging his aide's point. "You're right. I should be there. But I'm not going to make fiery speeches that stir up passions. Instead, I'm going to call for unity, for dialogue, for a return to the America I fell in love with when I came here as a young immigrant." The phone in his pocket rang. The name Mitt Romney appeared on the screen. Schwarzenegger answered. "Mitt, good morning." "Arnold, I heard you're going to speak at the rally. Are you sure this is a wise decision? Are you sure it's wise to remain silent when our democracy is under threat?" Schwarzenegger calmly replied. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Romney said quietly, "I and other senators have been discussing this all night. Many of us share your concerns, but we are afraid to confront the president openly. His control over the party is too strong. Mitt, I understand your concerns, but sometimes you have to put country before party, principles before political expediency. History will judge us not by how many years we spent in the Senate, but by whether we had the courage to stand up for democracy when it was under threat." Romney sighed. "I know, and that's why I'm calling. I decided to go with you today. I'll speak at the rally." Schwarzenegger couldn't hide his surprise. It was an unprecedented decision. A sitting Republican senator openly speaking out against the president of his own party. "Do you understand what this means for your career?" "Yes," Romney replied simply, "but I have to be able to look my grandchildren in the eye and tell them that at a critical moment I did what I thought was right." Meanwhile, a rally for President Trump was gathering at the Washington Monument. Thousands of his supporters, many wearing red "Make America Great Again" hats, chanted slogans of encouragement. Among them were the Clarkson family from Oklahoma, John, an oil company worker, his wife Martha, a housewife, and their 17-year-old son Brian. "I don't understand how Schwarzenegger can betray a president who has done so much for America," John said, clutching the American flag tightly. "Trump made our country great again, brought back jobs, secured the borders, and this Hollywood actor dares to call him a traitor." "But Dad," Brian began hesitantly, "isn't Schwarzenegger entitled to his own opinion? Isn't that what democracy is all about?" "Of course it does," Martha interjected, trying to ease the tension. "But it's one thing to have an opinion, and quite another to publicly denigrate the president elected by the people." "But isn't the president doing the same thing by calling Schwarzenegger a failed actor and a bad governor?" Brian persisted. John frowned. He didn't like it when his son asked questions like that. They undermined the clear picture of the world he had built for himself. "Son, when you grow up a little, you will understand that the world is not so simple. There are people who genuinely care about our country, like President Trump. And then there are those who pursue their own selfish goals or are simply jealous of the success of others." Brian didn't argue with his father, but doubt appeared in his eyes. He wasn't sure that the world was really divided so simply into good and bad. At the White House, meanwhile, Trump was preparing to address his supporters. His speech, written by a team of speechwriters, was on his desk, but he barely glanced at it. He preferred to speak spontaneously, relying on his intuition and the crowd's reaction. "Sir," Mark Meadows began carefully, "I strongly recommend that you stick to your prepared text. The situation is extremely tense, and any thoughtless word could have serious consequences. You think I don't know how to talk to people? Trump replied, exasperated. I've held more successful rallies than anyone in history. I know what my voters want. But sir, today is no ordinary day. There are demonstrations all over the country. The situation is explosive. One careless word could lead to, what for? For people to finally tell the truth? For them to see who is really on their side and who is betraying America? Trump raised his voice. Schwarzenegger wants war? He'll get it. Meadows exchanged worried glances with other administration officials. They all understood that today could be a watershed not just for Trump's presidency, but for American democracy as a whole. Meanwhile, a rally of Schwarzenegger supporters was gathering at the Lincoln Memorial. Unlike typical political demonstrations, this crowd included people of all ages, races, and most notably, political views. There were traditional liberals, moderate Republicans, and those who usually had no interest in politics, but felt that the fate of their country was being decided. Emma Chen, a 28-year-old teacher from Virginia, held a sign that read, "The Constitution is more important than the cult of personality." Next to her stood James Miller, a 65-year-old Vietnam veteran, holding an American flag. I'd never been to a rally before, James admitted. I'd voted Republican all my life and thought protests were for left-wing activists. But when I heard Schwarzenegger talk about what it meant to be a real American, I knew I couldn't stay away. I never thought I'd be standing at a rally with a Republican either, Emma smiled. But it looks like Schwarzenegger has found the words that unite us despite all our differences. At that moment, a whisper ran through the crowd. He's here. Schwarzenegger has arrived. A black SUV pulled up at the edge of the square, and Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped out. Without fanfare, without a horde of security guards, he simply walked through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, exchanging brief words with people. Mitt Romney followed him, and it caused quite a sensation. The sight of a Republican senator walking shoulder to shoulder with a man the president had just called the enemy of the people was unprecedented. When Schwarzenegger walked onto the makeshift stage, the crowd erupted in applause. He raised his hand for silence and spoke in his distinctive Austrian accented voice, which now sounded like a voice of hope to many Americans. Friends, fellow citizens, Americans, I stand before you today not as a celebrity, not as a politician, but as a citizen of the country that gave me everything. A country that represents the best that humanity has ever created. A system where power belongs to the people, where the law is above every man, where everyone has the right to their own opinion, but no one has the right to their own facts. He glanced around the crowd and continued, I see people of all ages, races, beliefs here. I see Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, and that's wonderful. Because the real strength of America is not in uniformity, but in unity despite differences. Not in blindly following a leader, but in fidelity to our common principles. Trump also began his speech at the Washington Monument. His speech, as usual, was emotional, fragmentary, full of accusations and promises. They are trying to attack me. They are trying to stop me. Why? Because I am the only one who actually cares about you, the real Americans. They are all in cahoots, the Democrats, the media, the deep state, and now even some Republicans. Schwarzenegger, this failed actor, was not even born in this country. How can he tell me, a real American, how to love America? The crowd responded with a roar of approval. Trump, feeling this support, continued, becoming increasingly excited. They're afraid of losing their power. They're afraid that we, the real Americans, will take our country back. And we will. Today, here, we will show all these traitors what true patriotism means. The words startled Meadows, who was standing next to the president. He leaned toward Trump and said quietly, Sir, please be careful with your language. There is concern that some radical groups may interpret your words as a call to action. But Trump, carried away by the crowd's reaction, merely waved it off. Meanwhile, at the Lincoln Memorial, Schwarzenegger continued his speech. I grew up in post-war Austria, a country that had lived through the horrors of Nazism and the consequences of fascist ideology. I saw men who had once sworn allegiance to the Führer and then spent their entire lives trying to understand how they could have been so wrong. I saw how easily people can give up their freedom, their responsibility, their conscience in exchange for promises of greatness and security. He paused and his voice became quieter, but even more heartfelt. America has always been a beacon for me, a country where the Constitution and the law are above the individual, where the president is not a king or a dictator, but a servant of the people, where criticism of the government is not betrayal, but a civic duty, where disagreement is not a crime, but an expression of freedom. Mitt Romney, standing next to him, nodded in agreement. It was a powerful moment of solidarity between politicians of different generations, united by common values. I am not asking you to hate President Trump or his supporters, Schwarzenegger continued. Hate is the poison that destroys democracy. I am asking you to love your country enough to defend it from anyone who threatens its fundamental values, regardless of party affiliation. The crowd erupted in applause. Among those cheering were not only Trump's longtime critics, but also many Republicans who had long felt morally uncomfortable watching his presidency, but were afraid or unable to express it publicly. One of those people was Henry Parker, a 55-year-old Texas businessman who has voted Republican all his life and supported Trump in 2016. I never thought I'd be standing here, he told his wife Elizabeth. But Schwarzenegger is right. This isn't about the party. This is about the country we're leaving to our children and grandchildren. Meanwhile, at another rally, Trump reached the climax of his speech. They want to steal our country from us. They want to silence us. But we will not let them. We will fight. And if Schwarzenegger and his cronies think they can attack your president with impunity, they are wrong. We will fight back. We will show who the real patriots are. And if that means marching to the Capitol and reminding our elected representatives who they serve, we will. These words caused alarm not only among the presidential advisors, but also among the police officers monitoring the situation. Captain Bryce Wilson immediately contacted the command center. The situation is escalating. The president is basically calling on people to go to the Capitol. We need to beef up security. Acknowledge, the command center responded. We're rerouting additional forces to the Capitol. Keep us informed. Meanwhile, Schwarzenegger's speech was drawing to a close. Friends, I have come a long way from a small Austrian town to this great country. I have learned a lot along the way. But the most important lesson is the understanding that freedom requires constant vigilance. Democracy is not given forever. Each generation must defend it anew, protect it, renew it. And today is our turn. He pointed to the Lincoln Memorial behind him. Behind me sits one of the greatest presidents in American history, a man who led our country through its darkest hour when it was as divided as it is today. And he left us with these immortal words. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But those words will only remain true if we, the citizens, are prepared to defend our democracy, uphold our values, and remind our leaders that they serve the people, not the other way around. He raised his hand and his voice filled with power. I call upon all Americans, regardless of their political views, to remember that we are first and foremost fellow citizens, neighbors, compatriots. We can argue without becoming enemies. We can disagree without losing mutual respect. And we can love our country without turning that patriotism into a weapon against our fellow citizens. The crowd burst into applause, and many people, including seasoned politicians and journalists, were in tears. It was a cathartic moment, a moment of hope for a country that had been divided for too long. But at the same time, another part of American society was moving in a completely different direction. After Trump's speech, thousands of his supporters began marching to the Capitol, chanting slogans against traitors and enemies of the people. Captain Wilson and his team of police officers lined up, trying to hold back the crowd. Citizens, stop. You have the right to peaceful protest, but not to blockade government buildings. But the crowd, spurred on by the president's speech and their own anger, was not listening. The front rows began pushing against the police barrier. Meanwhile, panic reigned in the Oval Office as the president returned from the rally. Meadows and other advisors tried to persuade Trump to issue a message of calm. Sir, the situation is getting out of control. If violence breaks out, you could be charged with incitement. You need to make a call for a peaceful resolution to the situation. Trump paced his office, watching the events unfold on the television screen, his expression a mixture of anger, anxiety, and, most alarming to his advisors, a strange satisfaction. They're finally showing who the real patriots are, he muttered. They're fighting for their country. Sir, Meadows repeated insistently, if this gets out of hand, the consequences could be catastrophic, not only for the country, but for you personally. There could be grounds for impeachment. The words seemed to finally pierce Trump's armor of self-confidence. He turned to the advisor. Impeachment? For what? For telling people to defend their country? For sedition, sir. That's a serious charge. Trump thought for a moment, his face showing a struggle between anger and self-preservation. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll speak out, but I won't apologize. I'll tell them they're right, but they have to act peacefully. Meadows nodded in relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, the situation at the Capitol was heating up. Several of the more aggressive demonstrators had broken through the first line of police barriers and were now advancing toward the steps of the building. All units, we are losing control of the east side, one police officer reported. We need reinforcements. At this point, Schwarzenegger and Romney, hearing about the developments, interrupted their speech and headed to their cars. We have to do something, Schwarzenegger said insistently. That's not what I called for. I was talking about defending democracy, not violence. But what can we do? Romney asked. If we go to the Capitol, it might just increase tensions. Schwarzenegger thought for a moment, then said decisively, We're going to the White House. We have to talk to the president in person. It was an unprecedented move. A former Republican governor and a sitting Republican senator would directly appeal to their party's president to stop potential violence. As their cars headed toward the White House, miles away at the Capitol, the first protesters were already pushing their way into the building, pushing back police officers and smashing windows. Scenes reminiscent of the storming of the Capitol began to be broadcast live around the world. The National Guard was on full alert, but their deployment was still an open question. Without a direct order from the president or the governor, they could not intervene. In the Oval Office, Trump finally agreed to record a video message calling for calm, but continued to insist on adding phrases that effectively justified the protesters' actions. I understand your anger. I share your pain. Your election was stolen. Your country was stolen. But I ask you to maintain order and peace. Go home. We love you. You are special. Advisors tried to persuade him to use more unambiguous language, but Trump was adamant. At that moment, the White House received a message. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mitt Romney were asking for an audience with the president. The news caused a storm. Trump's advisors could not believe such impudence, but the president himself, to their surprise, agreed to the meeting. Let them come, he said with an unexpected grin. I want to look them in the eye. I want to see them apologize to me when they realize they've gone too far. Minutes later, a historic meeting took place in the Oval Office of the U.S. President. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California, found themselves face to face, separated only by the presidential desk in a deep political chasm. Mr. President, Schwarzenegger began, his voice calm but steely, I come not as your adversary, but as a citizen concerned about our country. There is violence happening right now at the Capitol. People are going to get hurt, and you are the only person who can stop it. Trump, arms crossed, looked coldly at Schwarzenegger. Maybe if you hadn't come out with your inflammatory video, this wouldn't have happened. You've divided the country, Mr. Schwarzenegger. You're the real cause of this crisis. Sir, Romney interjected, we can sort out who is to blame for what later. But right now, our primary concern must be the safety of the people and the preservation of our democratic process. You need to make a clear call for your supporters to disperse. And what do I get in return? Trump suddenly asked. You two have spoken out against me publicly. You have undermined my presidency. Why should I help you? Not us, Schwarzenegger replied firmly. America, our country, the country to which you swore allegiance. You can disagree with us on policy. You can criticize us as much as you like. But this is about something bigger. This is about the peaceful transfer of power, the cornerstone of our democracy. Trump was silent, looking out the window onto the White House's south lawn. Then he turned to Schwarzenegger with an unexpected question. Do you really consider me a traitor? A traitor to America? It was a moment of truth. Schwarzenegger could have softened his words, tried to diplomatically avoid a direct answer, but instead he looked Trump straight in the eye. I believe you have betrayed your oath of office. You have put your personal interests above the interests of the country. You have used the sacred office of the presidency to sow discord rather than to unite the nation. And yes, in that regard, I believe your actions are a betrayal of the principles on which this country was founded. The room was dead silent. Trump and Schwarzenegger stared at each other, two titans of American culture and politics who embodied two very different visions of what it meant to be an American. Finally, Trump turned away. I have already recorded a video message. It will be released soon. What do you say in it? Romney asked. I call on people to be peaceful and go home. Do you accept your responsibility for what is happening? Schwarzenegger insisted. Trump chuckled. And do you admit yours? Your video caused all this chaos. My video called for the defense of democracy through peaceful means. I did not call for violence in any way. On the contrary, I spoke about the importance of dialogue and mutual respect. Words have consequences, Mr. Schwarzenegger. You called me a traitor in front of the entire country. How do you think that made my supporters feel? The same way millions of Americans feel every time you call your political opponents enemies of the people, traitors, the worst people in the world. It's okay for you, but not for others? This exchange was interrupted by Meadows running into the office. Sir, the situation at the Capitol is getting out of control. The crowd has broken through. Members of Congress have been evacuated. There are reports of shots fired. Everyone in the room froze. Then Schwarzenegger turned to Trump. Mr. President, it's time to make decisions as a real leader, not as a Republican or a Democrat, but as the president of all Americans. You can stop this madness. You must stop it. Trump looked at the television screen where footage of the riots at the Capitol was being broadcast, and his face changed. It showed not just irritation and anger, but also something akin to anxiety, perhaps even fear. He knew that now, whatever his role in what was happening, he would have to bear responsibility for it. Okay, he finally said, I'll make a new statement. I'll tell them in no uncertain terms that they need to disperse, but I won't admit guilt. I won't say I provoked this. The main thing is that you stop the violence, Schwarzenegger said. All other questions can wait. Trump nodded and looked at Schwarzenegger with unexpected respect. You know, Arnold, maybe we're not so different. We both love this country. We just see its future differently. That's the strength of democracy, Mr. President, Schwarzenegger replied, that we can disagree without becoming enemies, that we can change leaders without bloodshed, that our loyalty is to principles, not personalities. Trump nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Meadows. Prepare a new statement, the strongest possible condemnation of the violence, and contact the National Guard. We must restore order. As Schwarzenegger and Romney walked out of the Oval Office, Arnold turned to the senator. Do you believe he's really going to stop them? I don't know, Romney answered honestly, but at least we tried. And if he doesn't, history will remember that we were here at this critical moment and did everything we could to protect our democracy. They walked through the corridors of the White House. Two Republicans who that day became symbols of a very different Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and Reagan, a party based on principles and values, not a cult of personality. And in the Oval Office, President Trump prepared to record a new address, knowing that his next words could determine not only the outcome of today's crisis, but his place in history. An hour later, a new address was recorded and published. In it, the president unequivocally condemned the violence and called on his supporters to disperse immediately and return home. He did not admit responsibility, but he did not repeat the accusations against his opponents. Gradually, though reluctantly, the tension began to subside. The National Guard surrounded the Capitol, patrols were stepped up, and the most violent protesters began to leave the city center. By evening, a fragile semblance of order had been restored, though there was a sense of calm before another storm hung over Washington. Across the country, in cities and small towns, in homes and apartments, in bars and cafes, millions of Americans were glued to their television screens, trying to make sense of what was happening. Some were afraid, some were angry, some were ashamed, but almost all felt that they were witnessing and participating in a historic moment that would shape the future of their country for years to come. A heavy silence fell in the Clarkson home in Oklahoma. John Clarkson, the same Trump staunch supporter who had been screaming about betrayal only yesterday, sat motionless in front of the off-screen television. His favorite MAGA hat lay on the coffee table in front of him. His son Brian sat gingerly next to him. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked quietly. John turned slowly to face his son, his eyes filled with deep confusion. "You know, son, I always thought that being a patriot meant supporting the president I elected, defending him when he was attacked, trusting him even when everyone else was against him. But today, after all this, I don't know. What if Schwarzenegger was right? What if true patriotism meant standing up for the principles our country was founded on, even if it meant going against the leader you voted for?" Brian, who only yesterday had been afraid to voice his doubts, suddenly felt a strange change, not so much in the country or politics, but in his own family. For the first time in a long time, They could talk to each other sincerely, without fear and anger. And this seemed more important than any political battles. And in Washington, sitting in his hotel room, Arnold Schwarzenegger looked out over the city at night and thought about the long journey he had made, from a small Austrian town to the heart of American politics. He had not sought this role, had not sought to be a political symbol or a voice of resistance. But when the moment demanded that he speak out, he could not remain silent. "I will come back," he said quietly to himself, smiling at his famous line from the Terminator. And in those words there was no threat, but a promise to never give up in the fight for democracy, for unity, for the America he once chose as his home, and which he loved with all his heart. Epilogue: Dawn. The sunrise over Washington that morning was especially beautiful. The first rays painted the Washington Monument a soft pink, reflected in the waters of the Potomac, and illuminated the Capitol, a symbol of American democracy that has survived many crises, including yesterday. The city was waking up slowly, like a patient undergoing major surgery. The streets, filled with angry protesters the day before, were now empty and waiting. Evidence of the chaos from the previous day was everywhere. Broken storefronts, overturned trash cans, discarded banners and flags. The National Guard patrolled the main streets, and a new, more robust security perimeter had been established around the Capitol. Arnold Schwarzenegger was awakened in his hotel room by the ringing of his phone. It was Jacob, his assistant. "Arnie, turn on the TV, the news channel. You have to see this." Schwarzenegger picked up the remote and turned on CNN. On the screen was Donald Trump, delivering an address from the White House Rose Garden. His face looked unusually tired, almost aged overnight. The camera showed Mike Pence, the vice president, standing next to him, still cautiously silent. "My fellow Americans," Trump began, his voice lacking his usual self-assurance. "The events of yesterday have shocked us all. Violence and unrest have no place in our great country. Those who break the law will be held accountable." Schwarzenegger leaned closer to the screen, not believing his ears. This was not the Trump he knew. Impulsive, aggressive, never admitting mistakes. "After much deliberation and consultation with my team, I have made a decision," Trump continued. "For the good of our nation and for the sake of peace and unity, I unequivocally condemn yesterday's unrest and call on all my supporters to respect the constitutional process. I will ensure a peaceful transition of power on January 20th. Across the country, millions of Americans held their breath as they watched their television screens. It was the president's first address since the chaos at the Capitol, and it sounded very different from his usual speeches. "The events of yesterday," Trump continued, his face clearly showing the internal struggle, "showed how fragile peace can be in our society. I have always strived to make America great again, and I now understand that the greatness of this country is inseparable from respect for the rule of law and our democratic institutions. So I call on all Americans to reject violence and find ways to engage in constructive dialogue." The camera showed the faces of journalists in the press area, which showed absolute amazement. No one expected Trump to say such words. "One last thing," Trump said, looking directly into the camera. "I want to address former Governor Schwarzenegger. Arnold, yesterday you said that I betrayed my oath of office. I disagree with that. I have always acted in the best interests of America as I understood them, but I respect your right to your own opinion. And I thank you for coming to the White House yesterday, not as an opponent, but as a patriot concerned about your country. Your words made me see things differently. And I think our country deserves dialogue, not confrontation." Schwarzenegger turned off the television and sat in silence for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't just a political turn. It was something more. He had just witnessed a man known for his stubbornness and egocentrism take a step that might save American democracy from further crisis. The phone rang again. This time it was Mitt Romney. "Did you see?" he asked without greeting. "Yes," Schwarzenegger replied. "I can't believe it. This doesn't sound like the Trump we know. They say the Republican leadership has given him an ultimatum. Either he condemns the violence and guarantees a peaceful transfer of power, or they will support the impeachment resolution. Several key ministers have also threatened to resign. But it's not just that. I think yesterday's meeting with you really had an impact on him." "It doesn't really matter what made him change his position," Schwarzenegger said. "What matters is that he made the right choice. For the country. For democracy. And for your place in history," Romney added. "Arnold, you changed the narrative. Your video, your words about democracy, how easily it can be lost. It gave a lot of Republicans pause. Many of us have been silent for too long, afraid of the wrath of Trump and his supporters. You gave us a voice. After his conversation with Romney, Schwarzenegger stepped out onto the balcony of his hotel room and looked out over the Washington skyline. He thought about his father, who had once been an active Nazi and carried that guilt with him for the rest of his life. He thought about the history lessons he had learned from his Austrian childhood, and about the America he had come to love precisely for its ability to weather crises and always emerge stronger. His thoughts were interrupted by Jacob, who entered the room with a tablet in his hands. "Arnie, you need to see this. It's happening all over the country." He showed a screen full of social media. The hashtag Schwarzenegger Save America was trending on Twitter. But that wasn't what caught Arnold's attention. He saw photos and videos from all over the country, in New York and Los Angeles, in Dallas and Miami, in small Midwestern towns and rural backwaters, Trump supporters and Biden supporters taking to the streets together. They weren't chanting slogans or waving flags. They were just talking to each other, hugging, singing patriotic songs together. In Oklahoma, the Millers, those same staunch Trump supporters, invited their neighbors, a married couple who always voted Democratic, to a barbecue. In Michigan, a store owner who had boarded up his windows yesterday for fear of unrest opened his doors today and hung a sign. "All Americans are welcome, regardless of their political views." "It's unbelievable," Schwarzenegger whispered, looking at more and more evidence that something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in American society. "And that's because of you," Jacob said. "Your words about unity, about values that transcend party, about what it means to be a true American, they resonated. A lot of people, Republicans and Democrats alike, were tired of division, tired of hatred. They were just waiting for someone to remind them that they could disagree and still be one nation." Schwarzenegger's phone rang again. He didn't recognize the number but answered. "Mr. Schwarzenegger, this is John Miller from Oklahoma. You don't know me, but I have to tell you something. I've been a Republican my whole life. I voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. I believed him. And when you released your video, at first I was furious. I thought you were a traitor. But then I forced myself to listen to your words. Really listen. And they made me think about our country, about what it means to be a patriot, about the example I'm setting for my son." John's voice cracked, and Schwarzenegger could hear that he was trying to hold back tears. "I just wanted to say thank you for reminding me that being an American is about more than supporting a particular politician or party. It's about believing in certain principles, in freedom, in democracy, in equality under the law. And I want you to know that today I invited my neighbors over for a barbecue that I haven't spoken to in 4 years because of political differences, and we had the best day in a long time." "Thank you, John," Schwarzenegger replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "It's not me who deserves the gratitude. It's you and the millions of Americans who have found the strength to transcend our differences and remember what unites us." After the call, Schwarzenegger stood for a long time at the window, looking at the city, which was beginning to come to life. People on the streets, tense and looking around warily yesterday, were smiling at each other today. Somewhere in the park, a band began to play "America the Beautiful," and people stopped to listen, some singing along. His phone rang again. This time it was the White House number. "Mr. Schwarzenegger? President Trump asked me to give you a message." It was not the president himself, but his new chief of staff, a clear sign that there has been a major shakeup in the White House following yesterday's events. "The president asked me to tell you that he has reconsidered his position since your meeting. He wanted you to know that your words have made him think about his legacy. He said, and I quote, 'Tell Arnold that I am not a man who changes his mind easily, but yesterday I saw the country on the brink of disaster, and that is not the legacy I want to leave. I have always wanted to go down in history as a strong president. But true strength does not come from stirring up trouble, but from having the courage to step back when the country needs it.' It takes real courage," Schwarzenegger said earnestly, "and I respect your decision." You know what's weird? After I made that statement, I felt relief, like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And something else. I got a call from Biden. He proposed creating a bipartisan commission on national unity. He said he wanted me to be a part of it after he left office, so that we could work together to heal the wounds in our society. And what did you answer? I said I'd think about it, but honestly, I like the idea. Maybe it's the best way to preserve my legacy, not as a divider, but as a unifier. After this message, Schwarzenegger felt he needed some fresh air. He went down to the hotel lobby and out into the street, accompanied by two security agents who kept a respectful distance. On the streets of Washington, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. National Guardsmen stood at intersections. Military jeeps patrolled major thoroughfares. Street sweepers worked, clearing the streets of the last night's riots. People walked with their heads down, many stopping in front of storefronts where televisions were showing the latest news. There was a sense in the air that the country had just peered into an abyss and at the last moment pulled back from the brink. Schwarzenegger hadn't walked more than a block before he was noticed. First, it was a truck driver who honked his horn and gave him a thumbs up. Then it was a group of college students who started filming him with their phones. And then something amazing happened. An older man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap walked up to him, saluted, and said, "Thank you, sir. I don't always agree with your politics, but yesterday you acted like a true American." A middle-aged woman approached him, holding the hand of a little girl. The child clutched a tattered American flag. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Schwarzenegger," the woman said quietly. "I'm Lisa Warren, and this is my daughter, Emma. My husband is in the National Guard. He's at the Capitol right now. Yesterday, when the riots started, I thought I was going to lose him. And today, Emma saw you on TV, and..." The girl, who looked no more than 6 years old, looked at Schwarzenegger with wide eyes, mixing fear and hope. "Mr. Terminator," she said in a quiet voice, "thank you for protecting our country. Dad said you were stronger than the bad people. You wouldn't let them hurt my dad, would you?" Schwarzenegger dropped to one knee, bringing himself at eye level with the child. His face, usually hard and determined, softened. In that moment, he was neither a politician nor a movie star, just a man talking to a frightened child. "Emma," he said in his distinctive, accented voice, but unusually softly, "you know, in my movies, the Terminator always beats the bad guys. But in real life, the real heroes are people like your dad, the ones who protect our country and our laws. And I promise you that I will do everything in my power to help your dad and all the other defenders of order. Because real strength doesn't come from muscles like the Terminator. It comes from the courage to stand up for what's right." The girl looked at him seriously for a few seconds, then suddenly stepped forward and hugged him tightly. Schwarzenegger froze for a moment in surprise, then carefully hugged the child back. His bodyguards exchanged nervous glances, but did not intervene. The moment was captured by a nearby Washington Post photographer, and within an hour the photo had spread across news sites and social media. By evening it had become a symbol of hope, eclipsing the images of the previous day's violence at the Capitol. The Terminator and America's hope was how one major news outlet dubbed the image. Back at his hotel, Schwarzenegger found he had a text from President-elect Biden asking for a call. He immediately called. "Arnold," Biden began gravely, his voice weary but determined, "what you did yesterday took enormous courage. To stand up to the sitting president of your party, risking everything, your reputation, your business interests, even your personal safety, that is the act of a true patriot." "I did only what I had to do," Schwarzenegger replied simply, "what the moment demanded." "In times of crisis, it's these kinds of actions that define us," Biden said. "I don't want to take up your time, but I have a proposal. After I'm inaugurated, I plan to create a bipartisan commission on national unity, not for show, but to really work to heal this country. We've been divided for too long. For too long, we've seen each other as enemies rather than as fellow citizens with different perspectives. That has to change, and I want you to be part of that commission." Schwarzenegger did not answer right away. He went to the window and looked at the panorama of Washington, at the Capitol, which yesterday had been besieged by an angry mob, and today stood again as a symbol of American democracy. "You know, Joe, when I came to America, I had a few dollars in my pocket and a dream, the American dream. And this country has given me everything: success, fame, the opportunity to serve as governor of a great state. I've always felt that I owe America. And if there's anything I can do right now to help heal the wounds of our society, I'm willing to do it." Biden smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. "That's what I thought you'd say. I couldn't imagine a better response from the guy who once said, 'I'll be back.'" They both laughed, and the laughter was like a breath of fresh air, like a promise that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward, a way to the light. A few days later, when Schwarzenegger returned to California, he received an unexpected package. It came not from the White House officially, but through Trump's personal assistant. Inside was a framed photograph of their final meeting in the Oval Office, captured by a White House photographer. The image showed two men who were so different and yet both embodied aspects of the American dream. Trump, the businessman who became president, and Schwarzenegger, the immigrant who became a Hollywood star and governor. On the back of the photograph was a short note, in Trump's signature, large, bold handwriting, "To Arnold. We disagree on many things, but we both love this country in our own ways. Perhaps you were right about some things. DT." Schwarzenegger stared at the photo for a long time. Then he placed it on his desk. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder that he was right, but as evidence that even in the darkest times, American democracy can find a way forward. And that sometimes it only takes one person willing to stand up and tell the truth, even when that truth is inconvenient. And in hundreds of thousands of American homes, people watch the news about the unexpected turn of events, about Trump's speech admitting defeat, about the spontaneous expressions of unity across the country, and they felt that something had changed, that something important had been preserved. And many of them, including those who had never cared about politics before, understood an important lesson. Democracy is not just a system of government. It is the daily choice of every citizen, a choice for truth over convenient lies, for unity over division, for principles over personalities. And even if there were hard times ahead, even if the divisions did not disappear overnight, the seeds of a new understanding, a new approach to politics and civic duty had been sown. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who went from bodybuilder to movie hero to governor, now added another line to his amazing biography, defender of American democracy in its hour of greatest peril. At his home in California, he sat down at his computer to write another message to the American people. And the first line of this message read, "I always said that I would return. And today I return not as an actor, not as a politician, but as a citizen of a country that has shown the world that even in the darkest times, the light of democracy cannot be extinguished if there are people ready to stand for it." His fingers hovered over the keyboard when he heard the phone ring. It was Jacob. "Arnie, turn on the TV. You won't believe it." Every news channel showed the same picture. Thousands of people all over the country, in big cities and small towns, taking to the streets with American flags and signs that said, "America stands united." Democrats and Republicans, young and old, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, all together under one flag with one message: America stands united. And among this sea of people, posters flashed with his, Arnold's, face and the words from his address. Democracy is not guaranteed. It requires the protection and vigilance of each generation. Schwarzenegger turned off the TV and returned to his computer. But instead of continuing his address, he wrote just one line: "I can leave with peace of mind. America is now in good hands, in the hands of its citizens." He posted the message on Twitter, and within minutes it had been retweeted hundreds of thousands of times, symbolizing a new day, a new beginning for a country that had been through fire and emerged stronger. At dawn the next day, Arnold stood on the balcony of his Los Angeles home. His phone kept vibrating with messages, but he had turned it off. What he needed now was silence and a moment of solitude. He held two things in his hands: the small American flag Emma had given him the day before, and a yellowed black and white photograph of a young Austrian weightlifter with a cheeky smile who had just arrived in America with a few dollars in his pocket and a big dream. The rising sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and purple. A military helicopter flew overhead, a reminder that the crisis was not yet fully over. The country stood at a crossroads, its future hanging in the balance. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Schwarzenegger looked at the photo, then at the flag, and his eyes filled with unfamiliar tears. He remembered his Nazi father, the destruction of post-war Austria, and how he had vowed to never let such darkness consume the world again. "I have done all I could," he whispered to the distant mountains. "Now it all depends on the Americans themselves." His phone suddenly rang. Normally he would have ignored the call, but the number belonged to a trusted aide in Washington. "Arnold, turn on the news." Now, the same picture was broadcast on every channel, people taking to the streets of cities across America. Not in violent mobs, but in families, couples, groups of friends. Democrats and Republicans, young and old, people of all races and persuasions. They carried American flags and signs with simple messages: unity, peace, democracy. In Dallas, a Republican in a red MAGA hat shook hands with a Democrat wearing a Biden sign. In Chicago, police stood shoulder to shoulder with protesters. In a small town in Missouri, a local pastor and an imam from a nearby mosque led a peace march together. This was not support for Schwarzenegger or Trump, Biden, or any party. It was something more, a spontaneous awakening of civic consciousness, the realization that democracy is not just a system of government, but a way of life that requires the daily participation of every citizen. Schwarzenegger turned off the television and returned to the balcony. The sun was now fully above the horizon, bathing Los Angeles in light. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in these frantic days. "America," he said quietly, but with unwavering confidence, "I have always believed in you, and today you showed why that faith was justified."